I like the idea of Ilir Latifi. I like his Instagram.
Yeah. Yeah, I like when he's on a horse, but unfortunately that's not allowed under the unified rules.
Yeah, I mean, we should change that, but that's a whole other discussion for another time.
Yeah, not a great fight.
He's a surprisingly good counterpuncher, though.
Yeah, no, he's got some craft. He's just like, seriously, Yoel Romero is the only man to make this kind of fighting style work in a way that is like consistently entertaining to me.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Because like Latifi is far too much on the Derek Lewis side of that spectrum. He has more of the craft of Romero, but all of the like just waiting of Derek Lewis.
Yeah, the interminable, god-awful waiting.
Well, welcome to this week's edition of Heavy Hands, fresh off the heels. Well, not fresh, we got a weekend off, but almost fresh off the heels of UFC 225 with its scintillating main event of Robert Whittaker versus Yoel Romero 2, a fight that was somehow even better than we all expected it to be. Now we have... Well, actually, Pat, I'm not going to complain too much about this one. This is a UFC card. I think it's in Singapore? Is that where this is happening?
I think it is in Singapore,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Wild shot in the dark that hopefully it hit the target.
Big shout out to all of our fans resident on the Malay Peninsula.
Yeah, what's up, my Malay people? Yeah, the thing is this is like an okay fight night card to me. It feels like a substantially stronger, despite the fact that there's plenty of those hallmarks of, these guys are just here because of the local draw, which in the UFC's mind, local means like you live or once lived within 800 miles of the destination they've chosen.
I think maybe 2,000 miles in this particular case.
Yeah, that's true. This is a particularly remote part of Asia. But
at least relative to fight talent.
But it's okay, like this card. I'm all right with it. We've got some fighters that, like rising prospects that deserve to have our eyes on them. Peter Yan stands out notably, and we will be talking about him later on. Jake Matthews, of course, after his triumphant victory in his last fight, coming back to battle, I think, Shinsho Anzai, which is kind of a weird choice, but, what can you do? And
it actually made a lot more sense to me after I watched the tape on that, but we'll get to it.
Okay, all right. Looking forward to that. But the main event is pretty solid, I think. We joked that nobody asked for it, of course, but it is a true crossroads fight. I understand why people might not be excited at the idea of Leon Edwards earning a name off of beating someone like Donald Cerrone. But you have Donald Cerrone in the matchup, so people can always get excited about that. And Edwards, for all that his style may not be the most dazzling thing in the world in every fight, is a very, very deserving top contender. He's on a 5 or 6 fight winning streak right now and is developing into one of those crazily well-rounded fighters in a way that I don't think we ever really expected him to be when he first came to the UFC. So let's go ahead and kick things off talking about that. Cerrone versus Leon Edwards. What do you make of this matchup, my man?
It is an interesting fight. I think you hit on a lot of the stuff about Leon Edwards that is salient to this. The first being that he is not especially scintillating in his style, and yet he is not who we thought he was going to be based on what we saw when he entered the UFC. But he's still pretty good.
He's quite good.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reflecting on the precise ways in which he is good that are not the ways in which we expected him to be good.
Yeah.
So I think everybody expected when he came into the UFC that he was going to be a kind of a hot shit striker. Big, athletic southpaw, really crisp, quick hands, big power, good feel, especially for a guy who was pretty inexperienced when he got into the UFC. Mm-hmm. So more or less what we expected is, okay, we got a sprawling brawler. Who's going to make his way up the ranks on the basis of this really crisp, clean striking, and instead we have seen him, and you could be forgiven for that after he knocked out Seth Baczynski in what was it, like 8 seconds?
Yeah.
So it could be forgiven for having that impression.
Yeah,
what he's turned into is a really well-rounded guy who really is kind of a takedown first fighter and only strikes. Does not look especially comfortable striking with UFC caliber opposition.
Yeah, it comes and goes, but insert Nate Diaz here saying, "Oh, you're a wrestler now," because that is apparently what Leon Edwards was made to do. He's actually very, very good at wrestling, both on the mat and in his takedowns. He's a particularly dogged chain wrestler. And so like he has really kind of flipped the script on what we expected his style to be. I do want to talk though, before we get into the wrestling and how that might match up with Cerrone here, about the striking. What you just mentioned there about him not seeming to have the confidence to be a hot shit striker when it seems like it would really help him to be that dangerous one punch knockout fighter. Why do you think that is? Why have we seen Edwards so frequently in recent fights, completely unwilling to pull the trigger?
I think he's a thinker. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there are a lot of good fighters who are thinkers in there. But the thing is, if you're going to be a thinker, you've got to find ways to impose that on your opponent. You've got to do things that are going to make your opponent think, that are going to allow you to have time to make the reads that you want to read. So I think he's a guy who likes his space and he likes his time, but he's not using it all that effectively or efficiently. Like, you see the speed, you see the power. He occasionally picks just a brilliant shot, but I don't think the brilliance of those very occasional shots that he picks is enough to justify him taking the time he wants. He would be way better off just kind of barreling forward and throwing shit, you know?
Yeah, I mean, he's got really fast hands. He seems to have a good amount of power, probably because of how quick his hands are. Yeah, he could probably stand to be a little more aggressive. I think thinker is a good way to think about it. I think also there is, maybe these are one and the same issue, but I think there's a confidence thing going on with Leon Edwards too. I think you watch him wrestle, and it seems clear to me that if there weren't so many possible consequences to doing this on the feet, he would be a pressure striker. I think he likes being in charge. And when he wrestles, you can see like he could maybe learn a trick or two from the likes of Khabib, on how to keep a guy down and how to control his position sort of indefinitely. But really, he does tend to be all over people, constantly progressing position, constantly countering when they're trying to stand up. He has a very Colby Covington-esque way of working to the rear waist center of the body lock when somebody does start to get out from under him. He's a very dogged wrestler. And I think like that's kind of the inverse of that is what he tends to experience on the feet that makes him so reluctant to let his hands go. Somebody starts pressuring him, and he just like you said, he wants that time, he wants that space. And the problem is that whether it's whichever of these things is the explanation, he doesn't seem to have the right for as well-rounded as his game is. There's not enough depth to the striking aspect. Or at least he's not aware of how to use all the tools in his arsenal to give himself that space and time. He doesn't like feint. He doesn't really cut tight angles. He very rarely uses his jab. He just needs like, things to make the other guy think, and therefore give himself a little time to decide what he wants to do. And instead, more and more often these days, it seems like his striking has been totally reactive, where he is just letting his opponent lead the dance. And it's only when he starts wrestling them that he's able to dominate. And so kind of the feeling is that Leon Edwards might lose the moment he runs into somebody that he can't out-wrestle, because it really has been like the ace up his sleeve in recent matchups.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, I like the distinction that you draw there, because he is as confident as anybody you've ever seen when it comes to shooting a takedown, making an instantaneous read about positioning to grab the back, about capitalizing on a caught kick, all of these things.
Very good at catching kicks.
Yeah, I mean, he is instantaneous with all of these things that he does. And yet, when it comes to capitalizing on something that he sees in the striking, he is not doing it. And you're right that I think we may have mistaken when he got into the UFC that athleticism and the quick hands and the really pretty crisp fundamental punching technique for a kind of a feel and comfort that he didn't actually have in the strike.
Yeah, like maybe he's just cheating his way through by being so quick.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. But like for whatever reason, he is just he does not seem comfortable.
That might be like the correct read, because it's not like there's a ton of variety to his striking. It's mostly like he'll mix things up pretty well. He's done it for a while, and you can tell. But it's mostly a straight left, sometimes a jab, but often a right hook and then a straight left. That's kind of it. Like mostly he's a very like meat and potatoes kind of striker. There's not a ton of variety there. So I don't know. Maybe it is just that, but whatever the problem he's facing now, I think we could agree it could be solved if he were to add more layers to his striking. If he were capable of feinting and disrupting the opponent's timing, if he just needs to on the ground, pressure comes from controlling the opponent physically, but on the feet, a lot of pressure is implied, and he needs to learn to imply more. And he really has been struggling to do that against people who pressure him. Is Donald Cerrone going to pressure Leon Edwards?
I think he is. Yeah, I think Cerrone is either going to be very comfortable playing a kind of a middle of the cage game and controlling distance and not letting Edwards get close enough to wrestle him. I think especially in tight spaces, we've seen Cerrone's footwork get so much better. That was on full display against Yancy Medeiros. That was the sharpest Cerrone's feet have ever looked. I don't think Edwards has the craft to find the angles that he needs for his takedown game. Like, does that make sense at all? Like, I just think he's going to have a really hard time getting a clean shot at Cerrone's hips. And then if they are striking, Edwards could always land a big shot. He's got tremendous power. Cerrone's chin has never been awesome. It is especially not awesome now. But I think if Edwards thinks he's going to kind of bull his way into takedowns against Cerrone, I don't believe that's going to work especially well. Like,
yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. The issue is like, it would be very smart for Cerrone to pressure. I'm not 100% sure he will, because, you know, he does tend to start a little slow. Like, I think he will eventually happen upon it if he does get the chance. Or will, you know, work through the gears basically until he gets to the point where he is really forcing the fight. But, like, to start with, I think he and Edwards are kind of okay with a similar-ish pace. It really depends on who Edwards is fighting. Like, even when he was fighting Brian Barberena, he let a lot more shots go. Even as Barberena was coming forward. But then he fights somebody like Peter Sabata, someone whose positioning is maybe a little better, and he just doesn't see the openings as the opponent's coming in, so he doesn't go for them at all. And so, I don't know. Like, the thing with Cerrone is we have been expecting his athletic decline for quite a while now, and I think it's pretty clear that it has certainly begun in earnest. That, you know, like, he came through in the Medeiros fight, but it wasn't exactly that like last hurrah run he had at welterweight last year or the year before.
See, I after rewatching that fight, I thought a lot more of it. I thought he looked really, really good, especially in terms of his ability to move in tight spaces. The weaknesses of Donald Cerrone are never going to go away. He does not like to be pressured, and he isn't especially good at avoiding that. But if you don't pressure him relentlessly, he can pick his spots to move around you as fluidly as anybody in this division.
Yeah,
and I just think Edwards is going to allow him to do that.
Yeah, but he still doesn't really move his head, does he? Like, he moved his feet.
Yeah, but that's an issue when you're fighting somebody like Yancy Medeiros, who's going to throw 20 strikes a minute. Like, Leon Edwards is not going to throw 20 strikes a minute at him.
Yeah, the thing is that when Cerrone began to pull ahead in that fight, I think it was because he got a read on what Medeiros was doing, and I think it, like, doing less, if Cerrone were to allow that pace, can make it a lot harder to predict each individual strike. I don't think Cerrone's defense, it has improved markedly in these last couple of years, but it's still very much like pattern based. It's pretty rote. So he'll throw a shot. He knows where
but look at the shots that Medeiros was landing on him. It wasn't Medeiros' first shot in a combination. It was the second and third shots.
Well, the first like 4 or 5 punches were kind of the first 20 through. Like, that's what I'm saying, is he adjusted. And if he does allow Edwards to have that kind of fight, and Edwards can use speed to just clip him with that first shot, I don't know. How does Cerrone respond to that? Can he take those shots anymore? I'm just a little circumspect about it.
I mean, Edwards is not Robbie Lawler.
Oh yeah, no kidding. Yeah. And it's true. And Medeiros is quite a power puncher as well. And he did not.
I think in terms of demonstrated power over a UFC career, Medeiros is probably a harder puncher than Edwards is.
Yeah. You're probably right. Well, I think you're certainly right, in fact. I
don't know. I mean, I would like to see Leon Edwards like kind of come into his own here, and maybe this is the fight where he does it, and maybe Donald Cerrone is exactly the guy that Edwards needs to showcase more of what he's capable of on the feet. But like, I don't see any reason to pick a guy who in what will probably end up being a mostly striking fight, who is going to be content to throw 6 or 8 strikes a minute, even if Cerrone is trying to throw 15 or 20 at him.
Is that a given though, that it's going to be mostly a striking fight? Woo! My God, Lucy was so incensed at the very idea of Leon Edwards taking Donald Cerrone down. I think I know who put you up to this argument, Pat. Let's see. Who is the last good wrestler? Pat is clearly muted and away from the mic to control his savage dog. Who is the last good wrestler who tried to take Donald Cerrone down? It's Rick Story didn't try.
Let's see. This is the issue here, and this is what I was trying to get at. Is it is very, very difficult to get a clean shot at Cerrone's hips now.
Yeah, but it's the kick catching that I'm really concerned about. Edwards is very good at it. And Cerrone is half the man he is without his kicks. He's got to throw them. And they're a very effective weapon. That's why he has to throw them. But I don't know. I think like Edwards does have the timing and the speed for the counters, and he uses that when you let him hang on to your ankle to finish some pretty nice takedowns. And he's dogged. Like it could also turn it, if that's the kind of fight it turns into, then the pace could be a factor as well. But he might also get, tied up in the clinch by Cerrone and stalled out. Yeah, the thing is, Pat, is like I can see a lot of ways in which Edwards' style combined with his youth can give Cerrone problems, but his style doesn't exactly inspire confidence either, does it? It's kind of like it's always kind of grinding.
I see his paths to victory. I just have a really hard time seeing, unless Cerrone is showing real signs of being shot, I think this is a spectacularly poor matchup for Edwards. That it's exactly the kind of matchup that Edwards is going to need if he's going to show himself to be a real contender in this division. And Cerrone's 35, he's got a lot of mileage on him, but from a skills perspective, Cerrone has never been especially susceptible to guys taking him down and holding him down. He has never been especially susceptible to getting pinned against the fence for long periods of time, especially not against guys who aren't going to actively pressure him. And when was the last time we've seen Cerrone consent to a slow-paced striking matchup?
Yeah. Even if it starts slow, it will ramp up. Yeah, I think you're probably right.
I think the worst-case scenario for Cerrone here is that this looks like the Alex Oliveira fight, at least up until the point where Cerrone hit that takedown and ended up choking him out, where he's just in there with somebody who's younger and faster and kind of bouncy at long distance and never lets him get comfortable. And I can see that happening, but Oliveira is going to push at a way faster pace.
Yeah. I like Edwards, but it's kind of frustrating to think about how his fights happen sometimes, where even when he has what feels like a really strong performance, there are significant chunks where you're like, what are you doing, dude? What happened to the game plan you seem to be executing for the other 15 minutes or the other, 12 minutes of this fight? And,
Edwards is 26. He's going to be, he is probably going to figure things out, but I just don't know. I haven't seen the things from him as any sort of coherent package that make me think this is going to be the fight where he turns the corner.
Yeah. I think you're probably right, and I'm gonna bite the bullet and agree with you. Much as people who listen to the show know, we very rarely agree on anything, Pat. So, but I'll take that L this time. Leon Edwards, something to offer, but maybe not enough.
Really, in comparison, I was much more worried about the Yancy Medeiros matchup for Cerrone.
Yeah.
That struck me as one that was way less favorable to him. A high volume power puncher who can fight it out with him in the pocket and who knows how to pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. Very true. God, but who is the last wrestler that Cerrone faced? But anyway, okay, we'll move on. Otherwise, I'll just torture myself overthinking this shit. Both of us going with Donald Cerrone then. And that pretty much does it for our first segment. When we come back, there are a couple other fights from this card that we want to talk about. A couple more than a couple, in fact. We've got Tyson Pedro versus Ovince St. Preux. That is the co-main event. We've also got Peter Yan, hot prospect from ACB way. He's taken on Teruto Ishihara in what I think is the featured prelim. And then we've also got the return of Jake Matthews, who has had his own kind of up and down, fraught sort of career, but really seemed to put the pieces together in his last fight. As we mentioned before, he's fighting Shinsho Anzai. We're going to talk about all of those after this, and then get to some questions from our patrons coming up. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. The co-main event is next up on our docket. We've got Tyson Pedro. Oh, he is Australian, so I'm going to assume it's Pedro. And he's fighting Ovince St. Preux. Weird kind of matchup here, mostly because Ovince St. Preux is in it, and he has had one of the strangest UFC careers, MMA careers, that I can honestly think of. I remember the time that he, a natural light heavyweight, was soundly out-wrestled by Gegard Mousasi in Strikeforce shortly before coming to the UFC. It's been a weird run, and that has not changed now that he's become the master of the Von Flue choke. Tyson Pedro, an interesting prospect, I guess. I don't know. What are your feelings on Pedro, Pat? Where do you feel like, how much hype does he deserve as a fighter?
I think he is super talented. I think he has a lot of different skills and a lot of natural feel. Mm-hmm. He's really athletic. He hits really hard. I think that he has a fair bit of craft to his game, more than you would expect for somebody who's only been fighting for 4 or so years professionally. Mm-hmm. But he's still trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together, and he's still got some holes in his skill sets. Mm-hmm. So, which makes Ovince St. Preux exactly the right matchup for him. Yeah. I watched, I think our cold intro a couple of weeks ago consisted of us realizing that Ilir Latifi and Tyson Pedro once fought. Which we had both completely forgotten before that. How did that happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still not convinced that it happened. This could be a fabrication. The graphics in the new UFC game look really good. So, but yeah, it was like a big story in that matchup was that he had become a Mike Winklejohn striker. And I'm a little concerned about that, if being honest, as a path forward, because against Latifi, he got a sort of matchup that probably should have been almost ideal for that style, where you have somebody who's like just doing a lot of waiting, and you just get to kind of play tricks on their expectations because they give you the initiative. And he couldn't really, he's super young, obviously, but he did seem to have a pretty decent idea of the craft he was trying to use. And I don't know. I'm not sure what direction Tyson Pedro's game is headed in. If he's no longer going to be like a very aggressive jiu-jitsu focused mauler and is instead going to be like, Travis Brown, but smaller, then I don't know if I like that. You know what I mean?
I mean, I thought we saw way more of kind of the older version of Pedro against Saperbeg Safarov, where he really fair. Looked like he was trying to get after him. And I think that's what Pedro does well, is he gets after guys, he pins them against the fence, his reach is really long, and then he lets go these just cracking straight punches.
Yeah.
And I think that's really – and when he gets into the clinch, he's really devastating because he's very strong and he's got an incredibly long frame. He's good with knees and elbows. He's really good at framing. I think because of the size of his frame, the kind of leverage that gives him, he's really good in those spaces. Mm-hmm. I think for a while at least, he should just try to be a kind of a go forward pressure fighter and use his power and his reach to his advantage. And when guys get inside and try to tie up with him, that's fine. You're probably better in the clinch than them. So I think that's if he does that here, that's gonna work out real well for him against Ovince St. Preux.
Yeah. I guess the question I have is, okay, you went from fighting one of the best athletes in the division to fighting Saperbek Safarov. What happens now when you fight one of the other really good athletes? And that's the question: is how does that have like an impact on how Pedro chooses to fight? Because if he's going to engage in a more slow paced kind of fight with Ovince St. Preux, a kicking range kind of fight, he could be in serious trouble. I think. I really think like it would do him well, especially given the fact he showed decent stamina in that Latifi fight to push a bit more of a pace and hope to wear Ovince St. Preux down using the clinch, using body work in tight. OSP is way too dangerous at long range, I think.
I think that's what we're likely to see here.
Yeah.
It'll be smart. Him really getting after it.
Yeah, it would be smart. It would be smart. I'm not 100% sure, but there have been more of his fights doing that than the other way around. So it seems fairly likely, I guess. What about OSP? Any thoughts on him before we move on?
What might have been? I don't know. He's always a fighter that I'm going to think of as like, what if when he was like, Jesus, how old is he now? So he's 35 now. What if when he was 30, he had gone to a really big, really good camp? Like right when he got into the UFC, which was 5 years ago. What if he had gone to a really big camp and he'd spent a lot of time training with really good training partners? He could have been an exceptional fighter. And instead, he's kind of turned into a pretty good and quirky and weird fighter.
Yeah.
Which, that's cool. I mean,
yeah, it's fine.
All right.
It's fine. And he's still like, I do like OSP is, he's creative. I know people kind of overuse that word when it comes to fighters, but he is so very low on the ironed out technique side of things and so very high on the creative side of things that it does mean even if Pedro comes out with the right approach, tries to get in his face, OSP has shown a pretty good knack for counterpunching off the back foot, both against Shogun and in that fight with Pat Cummins. He does have some answers that might convince Pedro to go back to a slower paced long range fight. And he's also just a friggin' hoss, where he managed for at least a few minutes to somewhat out wrestle and out grapple Glover Teixeira just by bench pressing him away. Yep. And sitting up with Glover Teixeira in half guard on top of him. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I agree. I think it's a very good matchup for Pedro at this point. I mean, what better can you do, honestly, in this division? It's so hard to bring a fighter along the right way in a division as decrepit and ossified as this. So, yeah, I think I'm going to pick Pedro because I mean, if I pick OSP, then it's not as fun when he wins for no reason. So I'm going to pick Pedro as the fighter who will probably have a plan coming into the fight versus the guy who seems never to.
Yeah, this smells like a kind of a late stoppage win for Pedro to me. That I think he's going to take his licks because you mentioned St. Preux's counterpunching, and Pedro is not exactly what you would call a defensive mastermind. He's got some defensive instincts, but those don't necessarily translate into him getting less, or into him getting hit less.
That's the kind of Mike Winkeljohn hallmark I'm a little worried about. Is okay, he has the front kick to the high kick on the same side, and okay, what happens if you buy that? What happens if you just throw a massive counter right hand? And as Latifi proved, he tends to get hit by it. Or at least has to react on the fly. He doesn't expect that his shots are going to get countered, and hopefully experience will solve that. But you never know. I've seen a few Winkeljohn fighters go for a surprisingly long time without seeming to change. I think that's kind of inherent to the style. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'll be really curious as to see how Pedro's game develops. I think eventually, if Pedro pushes a pace, and I think he probably will, St. Preux will tire, and when he tires, he's going to get taken down. And if he gets taken down, I think Pedro's going to just beat 7 shades of shit out of him from the top. That seems like the likeliest scenario to me here, but I don't know. There's a lot of potential variance in that, so I guess we'll see what happens.
Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to one of your favorites, Pat, and a guy that I imagine will quickly become one of mine. Peter Yan is making his UFC debut in the prelims on this card against Teruto Ishihara. Why should we care about Peter Yan, again, for those who don't remember the last couple of times we've mentioned him?
He is an exceptional talent. We have seen a lot of really talented bantamweight prospects come up in the last couple of years. And I think of all of them, Jan might be the most promising. He reminds me a lot of TJ Dillashaw a couple of fights after he started working with Dwayne Ludwig, but with kind of more depth to what he's trying to do out there. Not TJ Dillashaw now, who is kind of miles beyond most other guys in that division.
Yeah.
But right when he was kind of starting to figure shit out, that's the stage of TJ Dillashaw that Peter Yan reminds me of. He is a very crisp striker, mostly boxing focused, though he'll throw some kicks. He's actually an Alexander Shlemenko protege, or was many years ago. So he's come up with guys who know what they're doing. Throws real sharp punches, puts together combinations, aggressive, mean, big power in his hands. Knows what he's doing on the mat. A really good kind of counter grappler, like very dangerous if you take a shitty shot on him. He knows what to do with the front headlock. Nasty in the clinch. I think there's a lot to like about him.
Yeah, and he fits, if you like bantamweight, Peter Yan fits right into the weird idiosyncratic bantamweight mold of being like not even particularly big for the division, but being a friggin' puncher who just likes to go out and put hands on people. An exciting fighter to watch for sure. How should we approach this? Peter Yan, like, as a developing fighter, obviously not everything is there yet. There are some areas in which he has to work. Are there any particular weaknesses that you see that you think, like, Teruto Ishihara in particular could threaten him? I
think like a lot of young fighters, Yan has better defensive instincts than defense.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Yan will do a lot of kind of shelling up when he's trying to pressure you and get after you. And if you are crafty, you can work your way around his guard. It's a good guard, but you can work your way around it. I think Yan is used to being the crafty guy. So if you can mess with him a little bit and get some reads on him, you can do some damage. He likes to move his head. He likes to slip. He likes to roll. And if you can anticipate that, not that it's easy to do so, you can probably make some hay there. He's the pace that he fights at, and Yan, when he really gets going, will throw 20, 25, 30 strikes a minute, means that he is going to get hit. So if you can land something good, you might have some opportunities. In the past, he had shown he was one of those dudes who was real athletic relative to the guys he was fighting. So he wasn't all that worried if your initial shot to take him down succeeded. So you could control him because he wouldn't be so worried about stuffing the initial shot as just keeping his momentum going and trying to scramble out or sweeping. He's better about that now, I think, because that's how he lost a fight to a guy named Magomed Magomedov, a real good kind of relentless wrestle grappler. Since then, that has not seemed to be a weakness for Yan.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned, just sort of on the basis that he is going to have a striking battle with Ishihara, which has not typically been the way that people beat Teruto Ishihara. Like, there are a lot of problems with the game of Teruto Ishihara. But not only is he, like, progressively shoring those things up, I don't know, I still remember, for example, and there's a huge athletic gulf between someone like Ishihara and my boy Mizuta Hirota. But Hirota is a crafty striker and can take a shot very well and does not lose his composure when he does have to take several shots and get knocked down a few times. And Ishihara was still kind of in that fight with him the whole way through. And were it not for the low kicks, which I really think were the key to his defeat there, he was also in the fight with Artem Lobov all the way through. People don't tend to just destroy him on the feet because he's very quick. He's got long reach. And, he can read opponents coming in. And that is the defensive thing with Yan, I think, is something worth being concerned about. He's very Gaethje-esque in his chosen methods of defense. He does like to just kind of cover both eyes and duck. And he does that fairly often. Well,
he does, yes, but then Yan goes through phases where he's like, okay, I'm going to try out my head movement.
Yeah, and that's a good point.
It's not really integrated, right? Like he'll either shell up as he's pressuring, or in open space will be like, okay, I'm going to let you throw some shots at me and I'm going to try to slip. And it doesn't necessarily lead to a counter. It's more like he's trying to see if he can do it.
Yeah, the thing with Jan is he's so athletically gifted. It's clear there's a lot of stuff he can do. He seems like a quick study. It's almost one of those cases where you're not 100% sure what his style is going to look like down the road, because like it's pretty clear he likes to pressure, but he likes to do so at a pretty slow pace, but not necessarily with counters. But maybe the counterpunching will come when the defense becomes more integrated, because as you said, sometimes he'll just be like, oh shit, he's moving his head. He rolled under that shot. He threw a jab and knew there was a right hand coming afterwards and rolled under and took an angle. And then other times, I'm thinking of his fight with Matthews Matos, his most recent one. He will just kind of be like a single shot power puncher for a good portion of the bout. But then in the third round of that fight, he came out and was just like a completely different sort of boxer. Suddenly the pressure was much more fluid. He was popping off really quick left-hand jabs and really slick, like left uppercuts. He was doing something that only really good boxers tend to do, where he had an educated lead hand that was firing from multiple different angles, but all with the speed of a stiff jab. And was throwing in combinations. It was a 1-2 that missed, followed by a left uppercut that actually ended up ending that fight. It was a really nice layered combination as he came forward. And before that in the fight, he wasn't really doing that kind of stuff. He was just kind of backing off every time that Matos would throw something at him, and then surging back in with one, maybe two shots at a time. So
yeah, it was weird watching him like flip switches at various points there, because he barely threw anything for like the first 3 minutes of the fight. Right. He was throwing like 3 or 4 or 5 strikes a minute, and then the last minute of the first round, he throws like 20 strikes.
Yeah.
Then for most of the second round, he's pretty measured. And then at one point, he's just like, oh, okay, now it's time to throw strikes. And he starts throwing combinations. He was throwing like 10 or 12 strikes a minute. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, he's throwing 15, 20, 25. And then he comes out in the third round and he's just blasting him with combinations. Yeah. And so my honest thought there is that was a 5-round fight.
Well, and he was just maybe being very smart for a young fighter.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two ways to read that. One is to say, well, he may have taken too much time, or it took him a little while to figure things out. Matos is actually also a pretty good striker himself. Like he was a pretty hot prospect a few years ago. So,
and he hung in there in that fight. He gave like Jan some real legitimate challenges to worry about in the pocket. Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of both. Like I think you're right. I hadn't thought of that, but Jan was probably just thinking, okay, take it easy at first. And let a little distance elapse behind you before you start opening up. But then again, you don't necessarily, that doesn't mean like remove the jab from your skill set to do that. You know what I mean? That should be when you're jabbing the most, you would think, when you're trying to just sort of control time without having to get into a fight just yet.
It depends. But what should be clear is that the standard to which we're holding a guy who's been fighting as a pro for 3.5 years is indicative of how much talent he has.
Absolutely.
Like the kinds of critiques that we're leveling at him are things that like Teruto Ishihara has no idea how to do. You know, like there's talking about like controlling rhythm and distance, and like Ishihara is not a bad striker, and he's powerful and he's rangy and he does some weird and unique things.
Yeah.
But like Ishihara does not know how to do half the things that Peter Yan does.
Bitches don't care about distance management, Pat. You should know this by now. Yeah. Just care about that left hand, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the standard to which we're holding an incredibly inexperienced prospect is very high, and it should tell you roughly what he's capable of. I don't know. I mean, I think he's going to do some terrible things to Teruto Ishihara.
Yeah, I have to pick him as well. But that inexperience is sort of also the reason we level these criticisms at him, or because these are all potential opportunities for a guy like Ishihara, who for all of the missing depth to his game is like a very natural kind of fighter when he gets the kind of exchanges he likes, and is very athletic and very dangerous. So like if Jan does tune down the volume and try to get a read on Ishihara, if he tries to rely on the same overhand right too many times in a row, like it really depends on. It's a real intelligence check for Peter Yan, I think. It's like, how do you approach a guy like Teruto Ishihara, who pretty clearly has like one very wrong way to fight him, which would be to just stand in front of him, not really being sure how to cover distance and not throwing enough.
Yeah, I think the footwork will probably be the difference here. Ishihara's footwork is pretty straightforward, and Jan's is really, really, really good. So my guess is that we're going to see Jan get caught with a few left hands that he probably shouldn't have gotten caught with, and then once he gets the timing and the speed, he's gonna lace into him. What worries me more in this fight than that is Ishihara going all out on wrestling and just kind of overpowering Jan, who's still like a young dude and is still kind of filling out his frame.
Could be. Ishihara is very big for a bantamweight. Or at least we'll have a lot of leverage on the ground. And despite like his work with Team Alpha Male in the wrestling department not paying off in previous fights, it's been looking better. Like it is, I think he is still growing in that aspect of his game.
Yeah, it's not out of the question that like Ishihara, who is very athletic and very quick, just like kind of manages to find ways to blast double a guy who's thinking that he's going to get a striking matchup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it wouldn't be the first time that's happened to a debuting prospect. It wouldn't be the last.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think Jan is going to be prepped for that.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting though, because Jan does not have the same capability, at least as far as we know, of like taking the fight somewhere else if he needs to. He's going to have to strike with Ishihara for the most part.
Or clinch with him. I think I think if he decides he wants to pin Ishihara against the fence and knee and elbow him, I think he can do that if he wants.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what he does. And he is one of those fighters, like just watching him develop will be a treat. So looking forward to that. Both of us picking Jan there. One more from this card to cover, which is not to say that there aren't some other worthwhile fights on here. It's really is, I think, okay especially for an international card, especially one that will be on Fight Pass. It's going to be so much fun to watch this like in the morning over the space of merely 3 hours. It's going to be great. But the other one that we really wanted to talk about was Jake Matthews versus Shinsho Anzai. You had an interesting read on this matchup, Pat, or so you promised. Why do you think they're making this fight, or why do you think it's a legitimate test for the likes of Jake Matthews?
So Anzai's had a real weird career where he fought like once in 2014, once in 2015, once in 2017, and then now.
I think the UFC keeps him in cryo until they go back to somewhere that's relatively near Japan.
Yeah. But the reason I think this is an interesting and well-matched fight is because Anzai is actually a real good wrestler and clinch fighter.
Yeah.
He's pretty relentless and he's very durable. And so when one of the things that I like about the Shelby and Maynard era of matchmaking is that when they have a guy that they think is talented, they match him up with guys who are going to ask him questions. Mm-hmm. And this guy, and Shinsho Anzai, is going to ask Jake Matthews questions about his takedown defense, about whether he can hang in there with a guy who's going to stick in his face. What happens when he can't finish? Can he just fight a good process fight with this new style? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But that's always those are questions that are worth asking if you decide you want to slot Matthews in there with somebody kind of at the fringes of the top 15, which I would guess is what they're looking at with him for next.
Yeah. Because I mean, we heaped quite a bit of praise on Matthews after that last performance, and I think it was due. But all due respect to my man the Leech, it's not a win that, like stylistically offers all of the challenges that there maybe could be offered to someone like Matthews. Like Li Jingliang was not able to, I don't know, because of the wrestling difference between them, because of the foot speed, the sort of in and out lunging style that Matthews chose to play in that fight, that was like particularly difficult for a fighter like Li Jingliang to adapt to. He really had no choice but to start brawling, and when he did, it turned out that Matthews is like actually a pretty powerful puncher, and also maybe the Leech doesn't have a great chin. And Anzai, like, he can pressure like a maniac. He can add wrestling into that pressure, as you pointed out. He's quite strong in the clinch. Maybe not like the best clean takedown artist, but he has options that he's comfortable going to if you're maybe making the mistake of thinking you only have to worry about the wild punches. And he can take a hell of a shot. So I don't know. One thing that does seem that maybe it seems strange, giving me more confidence in Matthews, is that I'm expecting him to be 3 times the size he was in his last fight in this one. Because when he fought Li Jingliang, he was noticeably huge. He was swole in a way that he seriously never had been. It is like he had become a man overnight.
Yeah, he is growing into a strapping lad.
He's growing into a middleweight, for real.
Yeah, kind of.
And so, Anzai is kind of small for this division. He's pretty strong, but in stature, I think he's pretty short compared to a guy like Matthews. And I don't know. I have trouble seeing him like wearing Matthews out, whereas I have seen Anzai have stamina issues of his own trying to push that kind of fight. So I'm leaning Matthews. I agree with you. I think it might be a pretty interesting test just because you're not going to expect to put Anzai away with ease. And Matthews isn't really the kind of fighter who puts people away with ease anyway. So he's going to have to be in there with a really, really grimy, aggressive sort of fighter.
Yeah, it smells like a Matthews win, but an ugly one, where he probably knocks Anzai down. He probably bloodies him up. If he can get on top, but where Matthews could also just lose a round getting grinded down.
Yeah, where he just can't get Anzai off of him.
Yeah. But it's an interesting, it may not be the most interesting fight to watch, but it's going to be one of those where it'll tell us a lot about where Matthews goes from here. Yeah. Because the UFC, I think, would love to have a good looking Australian kid, who could be a contender. You know,
I mean, they would love for him to be
a dude that they could run out there.
They don't really seem to know what to do with Robert Whittaker, but yeah, they're really hooked on Jake Matthews because he's more of that Paige Van Zandt style of up and coming star, I suppose.
Yeah, he's got the look. Like, I don't think there's any point in pretending otherwise. Like, he's a good looking dude who, as you noted, is noticeably ripped. So there's a lot that you can do with that if you're presumably the UFC, assuming they're still in the business of marketing young fighters. I don't know.
No, they're. The latest news is they're financially set due to the ESPN deal for the next 8 years or whatever. So they're probably just going to tune out and the fights will be like, I don't know, CM Punk's going to have 8 more fights in the UFC. Nothing matters anymore.
Watch him fight an usher that they've dragged out of the audience.
Poor bastard. He's going to have to deal with the greatest flying guillotine this sport has ever seen.
My God.
All right. Well, that about does it for UFC somewhere in Singapore. And that pretty much does it for our coverage of that card. We have a couple questions from our patrons, though. We're going to come back in segment 3 and answer those, and then that'll be it. So all of that after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. Hello and welcome back. Segment 3 of Heavy Hands here, and as promised, we have some questions from our patrons. The first one comes to us from Tom. Pat, would you do me the favor of making a sound effect since it's clear I've completely forgotten that we have one to use?
I am not going to do that.
All right, that's going to be the
future.
Pop,
pop, pop, pop, pop.
No, damn it. We got to get it clean, okay? I talked over part of it. Very good, though. That was very, very realistic. Our first question here comes to us from Tom, who says, and this is going back to Darren Till's fight with Stephen Thompson, with Darren Till missing weight and also his missing ground game, what does the UK need to do to start producing decent fighters? Is it a coaching issue? Lack of wrestling at schools? Talent pool too small? Question mark.
Yeah, I mean, none of that is true. Right? So Darren Till missing weight is not evidence of an epidemic of UK fighters missing weight. Darren Till does not have a missing ground game. In fact, he's extremely good from top position and has pretty devastating ground and pound. Though, if you wanted to be technical, you could, of course, give credit to that for the years that he spent in Brazil working on those things, which kind of undermines the premise of the question in general, I suppose. And there are plenty of good UK prospects. Go watch a Cage Warriors card and see how many good UK prospects there are.
There are a lot of them.
The UK is not producing a disproportionate number of elite prospects, and it's not producing fewer than its fair share either. It is one of the kind of hotbeds of mixed martial arts in the world, and it produces exactly as many good prospects as you would expect it to.
Yeah. Tom, I have a feeling, my friend, that you don't like Darren Till. That is really the read that I get from this question, because missing weight, I think, is definitely, you could call it an epidemic, but it's not one that's affected only UK fighters. It's been happening as fighters adjust or fail to adjust to the new weigh-ins and increasingly get bigger and bigger and make larger and larger cuts. But that is not limited to the UK. That is, I mean, it just happened to Yoel Romero for the second time, and many others this year. And then, like the UK does produce decent fighters. I don't know. I'm not sure what you're getting at here, Tom. There's definitely like a conversation to be had about the styles that different regions of the world tend to produce based on the martial arts they have access to. And I think you can see, as far as English or British MMA fighters go, there is quite a lot of good boxing and kickboxing. There's quite a lot of good Muay Thai and boxing because they have access to that.
Pretty good grappling, too.
Yeah, good submission grappling. Wrestling is obviously a weak spot, but there are some good British wrestling based fighters out there, and maybe really the answer to the question is like Darren Till should be a good example because he seemed to have traveled outside the country to shore up his skill set elsewhere, and that is something that tends to come in handy. Then you have guys like Robert Whittaker, Australia also not known for their wrestling, who just takes an interest in wrestling and has a really good team who is willing to learn on the job as they are trying to teach him. So his team, like the team of, Canelo Alvarez, also not known for any other fighters, but they do a great job with Canelo. And it seems like Whittaker has that kind of team as well. So no nation is like completely, or region is completely incapable of producing quality fighters, but it does seem strange. Like the UK's got a pretty good scene. So hopefully that answers your question to your satisfaction, Tom. Our next question comes to us from Nick. And Nick asks, Daniel Cormier, John Linacre, and Valentina Shevchenko. These are just a few of the fighters that consistently find themselves at a height and reach disadvantage. What are some of the strategies and tactics these fighters use to mitigate or even take advantage of their small stature? It's a good question, Nick. What do you think, Pat?
So the first thing you have to do if you're going to be a small fighter or a short fighter, I suppose, is to maximize the reach that you do have. And that is something that each of those fighters does really well. Valentina Shevchenko jabs and kicks. She throws spinning strikes. She throws things that maximize the length of her reach. John Linacre had a pretty good jab. So that's point number one. I think point number two is that when you are in range, you take advantage. You have a quick trigger and you let your shots go when the opportunities to land meaningful shots present themselves.
Yeah. You don't play around with, you don't take opportunities lightly the way that a taller fighter might. Where it's like, okay, I'll get him on the next one. There is more impetus, I think, to you're in range. It took some doing to get there. Make it count. But I like these three fighters as examples because to me they sort of run the gamut of run the gamut, but they represent like the two distinct ends of the typical this is how a short fighter should fight premise. John Linacre is the full-on maniac pressure fighter. He does have a pretty good jab, but, let's be honest, a lot of success comes from the fact that he is always pressing the action, and he puts his punches together, and as we just said, once he's in there, and he is working. And then Valentina Shevchenko is largely the opposite, where she tries to use her longest weapons to just sort of prod and poke and explore and prompt her opponent to take the initiative, and then relies on them to take their own reach advantage away from themselves. By lunging in or chasing after her. And then Daniel Cormier has kind of done both. In recent years, we have seen him being very much a light heavyweight John Linacre, marching people down just with more wrestling. But as a heavyweight, he was kind of the Valentina Shevchenko type. He used his small stature and the sort of extra agility it gave him to his advantage and really seemed very fast, very in and out, quick combinations, and made his opponents chase after him a little more. He wasn't such a dedicated counterpuncher as Shevchenko is, but he still did play with distance in a kind of the way that she does. Make the opponents chase, make them miss, and use your smallness as its own kind of advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think in all of those cases, none of them neglects the range tools that they do have.
Right.
That's such an important point, is that like it's not just a matter of getting into range to kind of whirl power punches at your opponent. It's also a matter of being sure that you don't give away chunks of range to your opponent just because you're shorter. So Cormier, especially as a heavyweight, threw tons of jabs. He jabbed all the time to maximize his reach. He still does now. Shevchenko maximized her reach. Linacre maximizes his reach, especially with those calf kicks that Linacre likes to throw now. That is an extremely long-range tool. So all of these fighters will get in there with taller fighters who have a reach advantage, and then will surprise them when they don't just give away long range.
Yeah, especially if you are going to, if a lot of your game is going to be built on drawing the opponent in and forcing them to be the one who takes the range away, then it really, really helps to not give up that long range to them. You have to make it known. Like I thought, this is one of the things that I have mentioned quite a bit in articles. We've mentioned quite often on the show that I think people consistently struggle to grasp. The idea that, like, to a lot of people, it sounds like you're just fighting the other person's game, but that's kind of a good thing. You have to make sure that it's just a facet of your own approach to the fight. If you're Colby Covington, you should not be boxing with, Rafael dos Anjos. You shouldn't just be having a kickboxing battle with him. But did it not help that Colby Covington landed so many punches and attempted so many strikes in the course of his wrestling-heavy game plan against RDA? Absolutely. How about the kicks that Khabib Nurmagomedov landed when pressuring Edson Barboza? Pat, I remember you saying back when that fight happened, it was when Khabib started kicking with Barboza that I knew Barboza had lost. And yeah, that kind of thing is very significant. If you're a shorter fighter, you don't want to just be the shorter fighter. Don't fit into that box so easily. And these fighters all do a great job of that. Like Cormier against Jones was another great example of somebody effectively using their kicks in what you would assume was the longer, taller fighter's ideal range. So yeah, that's important. Good question, Nick. Thank you very much. Our final one is a bit of a lengthy one, and I'm gonna read through as much of it as seems reasonable. This one comes from Davey. Davey says, "Hi guys, my question is about MMA records. A lot of people take umbrage with Mighty Mouse's record because of the names on it, but laud John Jones for the depth of talent on his record. While Jones has obviously faced the stronger proven competition, many of the fighters he fought can now be seen to have been entering the downturn of their careers at that time. While Mighty Mouse seems to have gotten wins over guys who have not yet entered their primes, like Cejudo and Kyoji Horiguchi. The question is, which is more impressive, beating a known quantity that is on the decline or halting a surging prospect before they have reached their prime? In order to see what a fighter is capable, do they need to topple the old guard and turn back the new? If so, are fighters like Jones or McGregor, who seem to have entered the sport between two eras, at an advantage, as they can beat the old guard when it's still impressive and beat the new generation before they reach their full potential? So core question, what's more impressive, beating a known quantity that is declining or halting a surging prospect before their time?
Probably beating a known quantity on the decline is going to look more impressive.
Yeah, because of the way that the law of conservation of hype works.
Yep, that is exactly the case, right? That like to be the man, you got to beat the man.
Yeah,
right. And beating somebody that people know, even if that fighter is maybe not the version of themselves that they once were, is going to get you more than beating somebody whose best days still lie in the future.
Yeah.
So there's no question about that. I think but the other side of the question is, one of the role of luck that comes into win these truly great fighters like Conor McGregor, who is truly great, no arguments to the contrary here, and John Jones, when they happen to get there,
yeah,
right? Like Jose Aldo was a different fighter than he had been earlier in his career, but he was not a declined fighter when Conor McGregor beat him. There was no reason to think this guy is not who he once was.
Sure.
When John Jones beat Lyoto Machida, right, there was no reason to think that this guy's best days were past him. Mm-hmm. Even Shogun, the knee injuries were as Shogun was standing there waiting for that fight to start, I don't think we knew we were necessarily looking at a declined version of Shogun. The truly great fighters are guys who are going to be acknowledged as kind of among that crew, get the opportunity to send these guys onto the downside of their career, as opposed to beating them after they've already started to go down. Yeah,
it's true. And a lot of times there is like some retroactive analysis you can do where it does seem like, oh, maybe we should have seen this coming because this. Clearly he was on the decline, and that's when they beat him. But it's important to note that, yeah, a lot of those big wins are what made us realize that the person was no longer what they once were. And in a lot of cases, how unfavorably they compare with the new guy who beat them is specifically what makes them look so very outmoded and so past their best. I think, like, to give a straight answer to the first question, just because of that the law of conservation of hype, it's always going to be more impressive to beat a known quantity. And that is a difficult thing because there are plenty of cases where the known quantity was declined and their name carried more weight than really their skills warranted at the time. Whereas, like a surging prospect can be really, really dangerous in ways that you don't even know of yet. That they can be a lot more shocking and surprising to fight than a known quantity. But because of the way that fight analysis works, like the only way we can do this job is to look at what we've already seen. And that is the only really, really reliable way of evaluating how good a fighter is. You cannot go solely based on the idea of potential. So a really unproven prospect, it just can't possibly carry as much weight. And there's the fact, too, that, like, you talk about luck, like when in a fighter's career do you happen to get the chance to fight him? That can be handy against prospects as well, because the thing with a prospect is they can have all of this physical talent, but experience can be a huge, huge weapon against them. Whereas for all of the declining physical talent you get in the old guard kind of fighters, they continue to learn and know more about fighting as their careers go on. And I do think that kind of thing is pretty valuable, especially at like the championship level, when we're talking about who has the great run of defenses against who. Beating more established fighters on that kind of stage just means more, I think. And there's no real way around that. So sorry, DJ. I'm not hating on DJ, by the way. Beating Cejudo and Kyoji Horiguchi. And the good thing about Mighty Mouse is we'll probably get to see him beat them both again, or at least I hope so. So yeah, looking forward to that. But thank you, Davey, for your question. And thank you, all of you, and to all of our patrons. If you are at the $5 level on the Heavy Hands Patreon and you haven't had a question answered in a while, please do not hesitate to send those in. And if you are one of the many people who responded to last month's post about getting into the Slack chat and then replied with a comment, and I didn't tell you to add your email to that comment, then please go to the Patreon, Heavy Hands on Patreon.com, and send a message to the Heavy Hands account with the email address you would like associated with your Slack account. We'll get you in the private Heavy Hands chat, and people are still in there chatting away. They're running a pick'em. It should be good times for everyone who likes our show. So I will get those taken care of as soon as possible. Before we head out, Pat, do you have anything coming out this week that people should know about?
Yeah, I have the first of 2 episodes on the Black Death. Something that killed somewhere between 50 and 70% of everybody living in Europe, tens of millions of people. So, if that doesn't terrify you, it should. That's what I wrote about, or not wrote about, did an episode of Tides of History on. I'm a little tired. This was a long weekend.
Yeah, I understand.
I was sick on Friday. I had 3 days.
You did write about it, though. You wrote a script and then read it.
I did.
All right. So, you were correct. I'm defending you here. Excited about that. We talked about that last week, too, the Black Death episode. I'm looking forward to that a great deal. Probably more than I should be, considering how morbid the subject matter is. But it's a very interesting topic. As for me, I don't know what the hell I'm doing this week. So don't expect much. I am working on some articles and some video ideas, but people who've listened to this show for a while know how that goes. God knows when I'll have another piece out. If you didn't see it, go check out my Robert Whitaker piece from like 2 weeks ago now. It's still good, I think. It's still worth reading. Anyway, thank you all for tuning in. This has been Heavy Hands. Find us on social media with your comments, questions, or concerns. And, if you get muted or blocked, then you're going to have to live with that. And thank you for trying. On Twitter, Pat and I can both be found on there quite regularly. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman, and I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. You can also find both of us on Facebook and check out our various works. Make sure you do listen to Tides of History. Check out The Fall of Rome if you haven't heard that. The Orig still holds up. And check out my stuff over on Bloody Elbow. And we will catch you guys next week. Until then, if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you know you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.